Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, either in person or on Zoom. This is Foundations of Global Health in conjunction with the International Orthopedic Trauma Collaborative. And I am Alexis Smith with the Office of International Programs. Just a little bit about our series. Global health is an area for study, research, and practice that places a priority on improving health and achieving equity in health for all people worldwide. Global health emphasizes transnational health issues, determinants, and solutions, involves many disciplines within and beyond the health sciences, and promotes interdisciplinary collaboration, and is a synthesis of population-based prevention with individual-level clinical care. And that comes from the Consortium of Universities for Global Health. Global health is a varied and rich discipline to which many healthcare providers, researchers, and faculty aspire to being professionally engaged. With our being a globally connected world, this ongoing programming through the Office of International Programs is designed to feature those in our KUMC community engaged in the field of global health. KUMC's faculty, researchers, and clinicians, our international partners, and our community partners. Presenters will share their personal journeys, their backgrounds, and anything that gave them inspiration, challenges, lessons learned, successes, and life-changing moments, and even the heartbreaks. The series is meant to provide a platform for both presenters and participants to participate in conversations while developing foundational knowledge and exploring best practices for engagement in the discipline of global health. And we'll be back here on Tuesday, April 14th, right here. And now, before I turn it over to Dr. Casa, if you have a question and you're in the room, please use our friend, Mr. Catchbox, because we have people online and we're also recording, and we want to make sure that your question is heard. So.
Thank you. I hope you guys can see me. I know I'm going to be hidden under here, but. Well, it's a pleasure to be here again and be presenting. My name is Bethlehem, but everybody calls me Betty. I'm a pediatrician, and up until recently, I was a pediatric intensivist at Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and currently I work at Children's Mercy. It's a pleasure being here again. We'll be discussing self-harm today and how it affects individuals. As you know, the IOTC is kind of focused on trauma and harm, so we're trying to address it in a broader term today. Just before we start, we're going to be discussing a lot of sensitive topics, so if you feel like you need a breather, you can always step outside, and that is completely okay. So what's the definition of self-harm? It's the deliberate injury inflicted on oneself, often as a coping mechanism for emotional distress. And it can happen in so many different forms. It could be common forms like cutting, burning, poisoning, or other non-suicidal self-injurious behaviors that we've witnessed throughout the years. And when we see it from a global perspective, individuals would have a likelihood of harming themselves around 17% from the world data that we have so far. And research indicates that it is going to be significantly higher, this number, when people are exposed to violence, displacements. It could also be associated with, generally instability in their home environments. And the prevalence of suicidality or self-harm is significantly higher when we're talking in regards to war or conflict-affected regions. It jumps up to 31% when compared to non-war affected regions. So how significant is it in Africa? Or in lower middle-income countries specifically? The larger percentage of lower and middle-income countries have suicide and self-harm cases that occur much more significantly than well-developed nations. And that kind of makes sense because of the socioeconomic and the stability issues that there are. And usually 75% of self-harm behaviors that end up in suicides are going to be in these low and middle-income countries. And this is because, as we said, because of the social, economical, and other pressures that are there, people are more likely to be vulnerable in that area. The populations are going to be disproportionately having high rates of self-harm. And when we talk about in the context of sub-Saharan Africa specifically, which is where we're focused in the IOTC, median lifelong prevalence of self-harm in adolescents was 10.3% in some studies that were done by the BMC in recent years, around 2020, and studies show that self-harm is higher in conflict-affected areas, again jumping to 30%, which was the pattern with the global population as we saw earlier. And gender differences are the most significant thing that we're going to be discussing today as well. Women are more likely to engage in self-harm behaviors due to not only having low socioeconomic class or like displacement and conflict, but also having pressures that are associated with societal norms and roles in these nations. When we specifically come to Ethiopia, where I'm from, we have faced challenges. We face challenges on a daily basis to understand how significant the problem is. This is because there is lack of mental health facilities. There's a lot of cultural stigmatization, even though if somebody is going through or suffering from difficult emotional, psychological problems, nobody's going to be bringing them to seek help. So we're not going to be seeing these patients. Again, there's going to be a lot of conflict-related trauma. So those things kind of make it really difficult for us to understand the gravity of the situation in the nation in general. And specifically, people like adolescents, women, and refugees, which are the high-risk groups, are generally not going to be coming or seeking help in general. So we don't know how bad the situation is, but we do have some trends in mortality and morbidity that we've been seeing for the past few years. This is the most well-collected data that we have so far. It's a little older, but nothing is as well collected as this one. So as you can see here, we have the rising pattern of self-injury and like self-harm behaviors. This kind of shows you a trend of going up, even though we're seeing the tip of the iceberg in this data. The other thing that we see is in Ethiopia currently, we have multiple areas that are really, there are a lot of conflicts happening internally. There are a lot of internally displaced people. Here you can see all the orange dots are areas that are currently having active conflicts. This was a 2024 data, but from this point on, nothing has pretty much changed, and we still have those areas that are still actively in conflict. They are civil conflicts, some are guerrilla fighters, some are, like government-related issues, lots of stuff. So as going through this pattern of underreporting, we have poor access to reliable and comprehensive data. That's the other thing. Not only people don't come and report it, but the data is not being collected properly, even for the people who are seeking help, who are coming in. So again, we have these problems. And often communities attribute these things to moral failing or spiritual failing because it's a deeply spiritual nation. And when I'm talking about spiritual nations or believing in a higher power, I'm not only addressing Ethiopia, I'm addressing the whole of Africa in general. And I can boldly conclude this because we pretty much have the same kind of roots of understanding. So when you have a deeply religious continent and you're seeing this kind of behaviors, it's because you don't pray hard enough, or it's because you're letting the devil into your life, or it's because you're failing to do your moral duty. So all of those things are highly stigmatizing kind of ideas in society. So patients are more likely not to seek help in general. So what are the causes? Again, we've been touching this for a bit now. We have socioeconomic challenges such as poverty, unemployment. This is usually the biggest factor for adolescents who are engaged in self-harm behaviors because there isn't a lot of economic opportunity. They don't have a job. Their prospects look very sad to them, so they're more likely to engage in dangerous activities, and that is one of the biggest reasons. The other is emotional and physical abuse and sexual abuse are generally not addressed. They're usually swept under the rug, they're not discussed, so people are generally more likely to go into desperate mode and have no other options or access. family conflicts, because family plays a huge role in this, in our societies in general. If you have conflict within your family, if you feel like you're failing your family, you're more likely to commit suicides. And this usually happens in attempted suicides that we see when kids, adolescents, they don't achieve like grades that they want, or like they don't get the jobs that they want, so on and so forth. These are the areas where we see a lot of attempted suicide cases. Domestic violence is one of the biggest issues, and we're going to come to it later on, and we're going to be discussing it, but it is one of the major reasons that women are more likely to be engaging in attempted suicides or self-harm behaviors. Depression and previous self-harm are also other causes that we see. When we're talking about social and cultural factors, I feel like we need to kind of go through it and dive into it and understand, because every country, every culture is completely different. As I understand, when I came here, I realized that the issues that I was facing in Ethiopia, I was addressing in Ethiopia, are completely different to what patients here are facing. So I feel like it would give us a general idea of what we're dealing with in the continent. We view this as I said earlier, moral weakness or spiritual failing. That is the social stigma part of it. Then we have the gender norms and inequalities. Those are high rates of gender-based violence. Around 34% of cases of gender-based violence happen within intimate partner settings, which are kind of comparable to what we see here in the US as well. But, you know, again, there are no means to kind of address it. Usually, community elders will come and say, okay, he hurt you, but it's okay. We're here now. It will not happen again. So go back to your home. And if women say no, and if they leave after repeated violence, they're more likely to be stigmatized in the society. Divorce is an unacceptable option. Recent years, we're seeing a little bit of change there, but it's a very big issue. So people feel like they're trapped, and their only way out is dangerous self-harming behaviors. The other is there's a huge collectivist norm. I really want to highlight this. In African culture, emphasizes community and family. You as a person, your existence, I mean, it's kind of useful and helpful and supportive in most of the time, but also it's a very, if you don't use it right, it is very dangerous, because you have to emphasize community and family. You as an individual existing is not the priority. The community thriving, the family thriving is the most important thing. So sometimes your feelings, what you're going through, get generally overlooked. So that again makes you feel unseen, and you feel desperate, and you're backed into a corner. The other huge issue is the conflict and displacement. Internally displaced people and refugees are more likely to be exposed to violence and loss and lack of support. Again, we're going to be going through this in detail in the next few slides. So from these things, I feel like the two most important things we're going to have to discuss over the next few minutes is going to be gender-based violence and self-harm, and again, conflict-related self-harm. So I have here cases that I want to discuss with you. These are real cases that myself and a colleague of mine from the Democratic Republic of Congo have seen. And these cases I want to show you because I want to highlight, and these cases are being discussed by the patient's blessings, even though their identity is hidden. So we have three cases. The first one is a 7-year-old woman. She's from the DRC. She was assaulted by rebels, and she was suffering a trauma fistula. She hid in the forest for 3 days without any medical help. And when she was asked, she said, I was afraid that they were going to catch me and this was going to happen all over again. So she stayed without getting medical help. This is one case. The second case, again, this is from the DRC. We see a 23-year-old woman assaulted by 15 men, had a chronic incontinence. The surgeons tried to repair the fistula, but it was so complicated that they tried 6 times and they failed. So now she has to live with it for the rest of her life. And she will remain incontinent because of it. A third case that I'm going to be sharing with you is a 13-year-old girl. She's from Ethiopia. She presented with extensive burn wounds, and this happened after being sexually assaulted while they were attempting to murder her. She was assaulted by soldiers. She is a refugee from Eritrea, and she came to us to get reconstructive surgery. But the injuries were so extensive, I don't think she's going to be able to fully recover from it. These are very common kinds of cases. The other things that I would say, and I would like highlight, are kids are more likely to be married off early in these nations. And we have seen a case in the last 2 months in Ethiopia, which is highly publicized, a young lady who is 23, and she's a very famous person, social media personnel, who is married to a very famous singer. She was extremely and frequently abused by him, that at some point she felt like she had no way out, so she committed suicide. And after the suicide, when her phone was being assessed, they found so many pictures of her being abused, bruises, cuts, and bleedings, and the man walked free without any repercussions. So this shows you, even though women want to come to the justice system is failing them. This is why they're being backed into a corner. They don't have a voice. So this plays a huge part. I just wanted to highlight this when I'm trying to explain why women are more likely not to report these cases. Gender-based violence and self-harm, again, has higher rates in African nations, as we said. Reports indicate that up to 42 to 90% of women in certain regions in Africa, usually, I would say, this is all over Africa. We don't need to specify. Places like the DRC, again, where there are active conflicts, there are going to be more cases of gender-based violence. I would say that 90% would be in that area, and more stable nations are going to have lower rates of gender-based violence. So factors that are going to perpetuate this is, as we discussed, limited autonomy, societal pressures, normalizing gender-based violence. It's okay, if something happens to you, it's probably your fault. Or if something happens to you, once there was a woman who was murdered and her husband is a judge. So when she was being buried, people were actively posting and actively putting out like statements on very legitimate media that they feel sorry for the man, that it's like what is going to happen to him now that he's going to jail. It's so bad, instead of a woman who died and was buried. So these things are kind of the factors why this kind of self-harm, women are more likely to commit self-harm than to seek help in general. So this is from the EDHS, which is the Ethiopian Demographic and Health Survey, that shows the experience of violence in women. So women are, when they're younger, they're more likely to commit. This is really one of my favorite pictures. Here you can see if a woman experiences violence by marital status, right? So women who are not married are less likely to be having gender-based violence than women who are married. And women who are divorced, they're divorced probably because of the violence. So the chances of you being, abused, hurt, or damaged gets exponentially higher when you are married. So as you can see, this is one of the huge issues that we face. When we're talking about the psychological impacts of what happens to you when you feel trapped and you don't have any ways out, there's increased risk of depression, PTSD, and anxiety. So those will lead you to self-harm, often as a coping mechanism for these unprocessed trauma that you're facing. And survivors frequently face stigma, rejection, and alienation, as we said earlier. So they're more likely not to prefer to leave, rather to kind of hurt themselves or trying to find another way out. The other issue with self-harm is the conflict and displacement-related self-harm. This is one of the major issues that we're facing currently in some countries in Africa that are not stable. And I remember that you had discussions about conflict and displacement with Dr. Hiddings in the past, so we don't need to go through the root cause of that. But generally, refugees and internally displaced people often face traumatic events because of violence, because of loss of family members, or destruction of their homes and their properties. And long-term instability, which usually these conflicts go on for years and they really don't get addressed quite early, will cause mental health challenges. People will have difficulty coping with the situations, and the cycle of unresolved trauma kind of like rolls over to the next generation, which is going to be the big issue. And thinking that violence is an okay method to deal with situations, because you grew up in violence and you grew up in instability. So the displacement camps report higher rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm due to lack of resources and ongoing insecurities in general. Children, women, and adolescents in conflict zones are particularly vulnerable, and they exhibit PTSD and suicidal behaviors more frequently than the general public. And women often face sexual violence, as we discussed earlier, and children are at risk of forced recruitment, especially in Central Africa. This is a huge issue, and family losses and trauma. Refugee camps in the DRC have reported a significant portion of survivors of sexual violence, reporting that they tried to kill themselves, attempted it, or succeeded. And these were usually coping mechanisms in those groups. Now, coping mechanisms in conflict contexts usually are either adaptive responses or maladaptive responses. And the majority of people who are DIPs or who are in conflict zones are more likely to go through a maladaptive coping mechanisms such as substance abuse or self-harm behaviors or suppressing emotions leading to prolonged distress. And usually if these are parents, they're more likely to have difficulty raising their children and making sure that they're okay. And long-term impacts of conflicts-related mental health problems will lead to children inheriting the mental health challenges of traumatized patients. As I said earlier, they're not going to be capable parents because they're going through a lot themselves. And the loss of trust and social cohesion among affected populations. So you'd have generations of resentment that goes on and on and on. So this group made sure that I was forcibly displaced. I am going to hunt them down for the rest of my life. And I teach my children to do the same. And it's going to be a generational hate that's going to be reverberating throughout. And the other thing is they will have difficulty to return into normal life. Even when you're trying to integrate these groups, they're going to have a hard time going back to how things were because they've been through a lot and they've seen a lot. This is a really good example of how children are affected by displacement. It's a paper that was published in 2023, and it shows the Syrian conflict and how migration affected children. So we had the children would have the pre-migration war trauma, which means they're exposed to war and violence at a very young age and see their homes being destroyed. And as they're growing older and they go through pre-migration displacement, they're going to have pre-migration displacement trauma where they would have low structural support. They're not going to school. They will have low social support in general. And most of these children are also exploited or they're being exposed to terrible things. So after that, even post-migrational acculturation trauma is going to be very difficult when they're trying to assimilate into a culture. So they would have, again, low structural support. They're going to have low parental support because, again, the parents are going through the same thing that these children are going through, and they're going to have higher responsibilities and lower opportunities. And at the end of the day, the developmental outcome due to this cumulative trauma creates kids that are low cognitive functioning. They don't know how to regulate their emotions. They're going to have affective processing difficulties, and they're going to have really difficult control of their lives in general. So it affects their whole life. It goes on and on. It's something that kind of continues. So the challenges with having to, trying to deal with all this self-harm and trauma that happens throughout this low and middle income countries is that there aren't enough psychiatrists or any professionals to support them. So in Ethiopia, for example, there's one psychiatrist per 1 million people, and that is just telling you nobody's getting the help that they need. There's limited access to care, especially in rural areas. They've never even heard of mental health. So those are going to be huge issues again. Again, we're going to have poor funding for this issues because nobody cares about gender-based violence or self-harm or mental health issues because there are bigger issues. I remember when we were trying to build ICUs for children in different parts of the country, we were told nobody has time for this. We're still treating diarrhea. That was the answer we got from the Ministry of Health. So you can see there are so many other issues. Nobody wants to concentrate on this, but it's silently killing a generation. And we're having huge issues that are going to be seen for generations to come. And the other is the absence of culturally tailored interventions. So we cannot take what we have here in the modern world, in the US or in Europe, and try to implement it in the context of Africa or any other low and middle income country where family, culture, and religion play a huge part. That just won't translate well. We need to culturally tailor these things, and we haven't done the work to do that so far. So when we're talking about culturally tailoring these interventions. We're talking about integrating cultural sensitivity into mental health services, and education awareness campaigns should go through social groups that usually kind of have a huge say. And we need to empower community leaders, and we need to educate them, because people are more likely to hear them than they are likely to hear a healthcare professional. Again, faith could be both a support and a barrier. If we talk to faith-based organizations and make sure that people need the help, that gender-based violence is unacceptable, young child marriage is unacceptable, that conflict areas should be seen and heard, and people who are living internally displaced should be having the voice that they need, then these organizations would be a support. If we really don't work with them, what they do is they would perpetuate the misconceptions that have been there for generations, and that's going to create more harm. So we really need to work with them. And interpretations of suffering need to be reassessed. We need to have conversations with most of these places in a very sensitive way, because suffering being glorified, suffering being your way to have access to heaven, all those things are kind of detrimental cultural and religious norms that we really need to address, and we really need to work with the leaders. So what are some of the helpful interventions that we can do? We can integrate cultural sensitivity, as we discussed earlier. We can do community-based approaches, such as encouraging grassroots initiatives for trauma and healing and relocation. And this has been done in South Africa, and it works tremendously well. They have done this work. They've worked with local community groups that have more of the ears of the society, and it worked wondrously. So I think that's something that we can kind of replicate throughout Africa. And the other is policy level interventions. Governments and NGOs should prioritize funding for mental health programs, and specifically in conflict regions. Generally, these young nations don't have a lot of laws that are safety nets for people who are vulnerable. And specifically in the age of technology, we're having to see this a lot, because in most of these African nations, we don't have protective covers for women. For example, things like sharing of intimate images without the consent of women is very rampant, but there is no law against it, so nobody's getting repercussions for it, and you can only imagine how that affects the women that are being exposed. And things like this really need to be addressed, so the law needs to be fixed and updated, and specifically regarding protecting children and adolescents from harm, and making sure that there are safety nets. Abuse and generally violence in the home that affects young children, they don't have protective safety nets in most African countries, and those are things that we really need to work on. Again, awareness campaigns are very important. We need to break stigmas, and we need to educate communities about self-harm and why it happens. And we really need to have also gender-specific interventions. What recommendations do we have? Enhancing mental health funding and making sure policies change to help affect change, and reduce stigma through education and advocacy, as we said earlier. And we need to expand access to care, specifically in rural areas and in conflict zones. And that is what I have for you today. Thank you. Maybe.
Thank you, Betty. That was a wonderful presentation. First off, I want to congratulate you again for matching in pediatrics at Children's Mercy.
Thank you.
They don't know. They don't know what kind of a young person they're getting, not just as a professional, but as an individual. Having said that, I think this was a very well put together presentation. I can't emphasize much about the role of governments in self-inflicted damages, if you will, or harm, if they don't prioritize population in low to middle countries would not take notice. I think it also exposes the ineptness and the incompetence of government, so they don't want to herald and kind of make a lot of highlight about this. This also is intertwined with the justice system, which does not address it. So if you have have sexual violence and so forth, if individuals who commit or perpetuate that are not put into the right right justice, then they will keep on committing the crime. And like you suggested, and you beautifully put out, it's the culture. I think we cannot emphasize much, especially women take the brunt of the injuries and the harm, if you will, because they are the core of the society. And once they get stigmatized, it's very difficult in many places to show their face, let alone come up front. I think many, and I can say a lot of things, but I think those are the things that I wanted to say.
Great job as well. Just love this presentation. I'm just curious, do you think the numbers that we have with respect to gender-based violence, sexual assault, things like this, that we have like in the global burden of disease studies, do you think these are accurate numbers? Do you think it's higher, or do you think they're overrepresented? I'm just curious.
I think I would say, and this is from my experience working again in a third world country, but I would say the numbers are much higher. We're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. Underreporting is very common, even in countries like the US, where you feel, I have a voice, I have like care facilities that are going to address this issue for me. Women are less likely to report them the first time around. They would wait after repeated violence, or when things escalate to a very extreme level is when they would report. This is because we are kind of like wired to think that a loved one doesn't want to hurt us. Instead, it is more likely that we create excuses for the behavior. And because of that, even in countries that are well off, you would see this being underreported. In the context of Africa, or like specifically, it's worse in Southeast Asia, I would say it's because the fact that you are going to report it is going to have a lot of repercussion in your life. You're going to be ostracized, stigmatized, you're going to be a pariah in society. And those are things that women fear a lot more than being, hurt by their partners. And if it's not intimate partners, women, I feel like, are also less likely to report other events because they don't feel like they would be believed. So because of those things, I would say the majority of the time we have a huge underreporting issue in these situations.
And then the other question is, do you feel like in these case examples you gave, is it isolated, sexual assault, or is it, do you feel like do you see more often a package deal, like a woman is raped, but she also has some other type of trauma other than mental trauma as well? Or do you just typically see isolated sexual assault?
And usually, specifically in the context of conflict-related gender-based violence, the sexual assault is only one part of what happens to the woman. They're more likely to have a lot of physical trauma. We've seen fractures, we've seen lacerations, we've seen women who have traumatic brain injuries. These are very common, specifically in these areas. And one thing that I want to highlight is this abuse that usually happens by militias or militants or soldiers. And this people are usually told from young age, when they're very young men, that to be considered a man, you need to be rough, you need to show yourself to be strong, you need to be dominant. And there is a very unhealthy culture of how we raise young men in general. And that really plays into what happens as well. So if we really want to address it, it's not only creating a place where we have good access for care for women or protective services or things like that. We need to address how we raise our men as well.
And I appreciate that answer, because that's one thing I've noticed as an orthopedic surgeon is sometimes you'll be treating a trauma in a child or a woman, and the chief complaint is not that they've been a victim of sexual assault. You'll pick up that they've had some injury, and then that typically leads you down the path of, then you find out that there was some assault involved. And then I think if you're going to do your due diligence, then you need to walk down the path of, was sexual assault involved? Because I'll tell you, I've seen that happen. But it's, as I think over my career, it seems like most cases like this come in with the chief complaint not being sexual assault. It's some other trauma that's occurred in conjunction with the sexual assault.
Absolutely, because they really don't want to report the sexual assault. So they would tell you, like, look, I've been hurt. Sometimes they would even say, I fell down, or like, somebody hit me. That's all they would tell you. So usually the first thing you hear isn't the trauma. And when it comes to why that happens, it's because there's a shame associated with hurting these women. And most of the time they don't want them to survive. So some of them are really attempted murder, not only just like hurting them, trying to subdue them. So those are also things that we really need to consider.
Thank you for your presentation. One question that I had is that I know you mentioned that sometimes like there's that like post-war trauma, or like I guess like in your experience, for the victims that were able to get out of that situation of the sexual violence and the sexual assault, what does their life look like afterwards, and what kind of like challenges have you seen them overcome?
Yeah, there's like a lot of things that we can say about that. Usually maladaptive behaviors are very common in these women. Not only women, generally people who are coming from conflict areas and zones, and they're being placed in in society around us. They usually have a hard time dealing with, like communications, social cues, understanding social cues, keeping a job. Usually they're more likely to abuse substances, and they're more likely to be withdrawn, like grapple with things like depression and PTSD. So these are very common things. They really have a hard time. And it's usually the one thing that I would say as a pediatrician that I've seen personally is this usually goes intergenerational. So when I see kids coming from parents who went through being displaced internally or going through conflicts, the kids usually have are more likely to be abused or hurt. They're more likely to be neglected, and they're more likely to have maladaptive behaviors in general because of the household is not really stable. So those are things that we usually see.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Betty, for this wonderful presentation. So I wanted to ask, this might be like beyond the scope, but what factors would you say might preclude women to being likely to have, I guess, a domestic issue, domestic violence issue? For example, like does coming from a higher socioeconomic status help, or being more educated, being more exposed to the urban areas? Like what exactly would you say might make a woman less likely to experience things that you talked about?
It's interesting because that's something that we always discuss. Is there anything that kind of like can shield you from this? So what we've seen is you being educated or being well off is not going to help you. What that would do for you is it would give you the options to leave earlier. And it would give you, like the social standing to make it okay for you to leave. Like people are not going to be shunning you because you're important in society. You have a place, you have a voice. And usually that is the only thing. But surprisingly, women who are well off and educated or like earning more than their partners in most African countries are more likely to be going through gender-based violence because of the economic dynamic in the house. They want to have more say, they want to have opinions, and those are not acceptable. Even from other educated men is what we see. Again, as I said, slowly but surely, these things are changing, but not fast enough, nowhere near what we want them to be.
and then they lose their social status too.
Yep.
It's like it's a double whammy. You are the loser in the first place. I would like you're the victim in the sorry, I shouldn't say loser. You are the victim in the first place, and then you're trying to report that. Then you become victimized because of that as well. So it's a double.
Thank you very much, Dr. Casa. This was a very informative presentation, and I really appreciated how you talked about like the complexities in trying to work against this and like how the government needs to be involved, etc. I'm thinking for us as medical students, like as we're having people that we're going to be treating from multiple different cultures, how would you recommend we like approach patients whose violence that they're experiencing is like really stigmatized, without us like being like demeaning to their culture or culturally insensitive, but still like being able to provide care? Yeah.
I think that's a very good question, because when you have cultural clashes, it's really hard to kind of understand how to approach a problem. And one thing that I've learned, and even in my country, there are very diverse groups of people with very diverse cultures, is to first make sure that your patient trusts you. As long as you create that safety within your relationship, they're more likely to tell you, and they're more likely to understand where you're coming from. So make sure you listen to them. Take the time. I know it's very hard sometimes to, like with a hectic schedule, to kind of take time to talk to them. And that would give you that trust between you and your patient. And that is the most important thing. After that, they're more likely to hear you. They're more likely to understand where you're coming from. And that cultural gap wouldn't be as big as you would think. But if we kind of push our ideas on them without listening to what they're telling us, then what's going to happen is they're going to be defensive. They're going to be closed off, and they're not going to tell you what's going on. And I find always that the longer you talk to a parent, and that's as a pediatrician, the more likely they are to tell you things that, you didn't think were there. So if you feel like something's off, it's probably off. So just talk to them longer and they would reveal things. So this is from my personal experience.
So I know you mentioned culture, and I'm also Nigerian, so like it's very familiar to me as well. So I guess as far as the culture is concerned, how do you observe the women of the older generation, I guess, relate to the women in the younger generation? Have you noticed that they give a particular type of advice? Because I know, like, where I come from, they emphasize that the women should have their own money so they don't have to be relying on a man and things like that. Like, what does that look like in Ethiopia or the IDP camps?
So there are like two polar opposites to this. This is what's very interesting. So there are groups of women who would always tell you, don't go through what I've gone through. Parents, grandparents who would say, make sure that you have your own money before you get married. Make sure that, like education is very important. That I feel like is a very universal thing in Africa, because that is the only way out. That's the only way you're going to escape poverty. That's the only way you're not going to reproduce poverty when you have kids. So they make sure that you get educated, and that merit is very important. But there's also the other side where, like once you're married, they're like, oh, like it's because he's a man. Those excuses would come in. So there are two sides to it. They make sure that you would have your safety net, but also there are like excusing behaviors still going on. And that's because this is something that has been ingrained in them for generations. And it's really difficult to fault anybody for it. But, like I see those two contrasts going on at the same time.
So it sounds like there has been this sort of like growing awareness that this is an issue. And that there's like, a recognition of the need for change. Do you see like that sort of growing like push? Like, is there like a substantial like movement saying like, hey, this needs to stop? And is it a matter of like difficulty getting a policy change to happen to help like sort of make the situation better? Like, is there a disconnect between like I guess like public sentiment and policy? Where's like, I guess the major barrier is?
Yep. I would say there's a huge disconnect between policymaking and what the public is expecting nowadays, because the policies are still going on as if it's like 30 years ago, but the people are trying to have more voice. Women are coming out, they're speaking up, they're, especially in the age of social media where like everybody has a smartphone, women are more likely to speak out. They're more likely, specifically, I would say I've seen a huge change over the past 5 years on like violence against children, be it sexual abuse or physical violence against children. There's a lot of women who are trying to kind of like highlight that and protect kids and things like that. And for their part, they're really trying hard, but they are being extremely prosecuted. They usually have to run away from their homes, and it's very active. Like we've seen so many women having to leave in the dead of night because they're being arrested for no good reason. There's a lot of smearing of their name, misinformation about who they are as a person, things like that. So the resistance is still there, but women are really trying to highlight these issues nowadays.
What can we do as healthcare providers? And how can we make an impact on this?
I think that's a very important question. As healthcare providers, I feel like we've been trying to advocate for policies changes for a really long time now. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. For example, we're seeing now there are bills that are running through the parliament to make sure that, people who are using intimate content and distributing it online are going to be, punished for it. That I feel like it's going to have a huge change. This is being run by some psychiatrists in Ethiopia, but there is way more to go. It's very hard to create policy changes in the context of African nations because the government is being run by few individuals. So it's harder to kind of affect change this way. But I feel like the biggest changes that we can create is making sure the awareness changes, that we're going out and telling the stories of abused kids and making sure that people understand that kids deserve better, or women deserve better, or men deserve better, because they're really going through this very toxic culture of being told that hurting people is okay, of being told that to be a man, you have to do this and that. So, everybody, I feel like, is being victimized in the society. So making sure we educate is very important. And when they come to us for help, making sure that we give them the right kind of help, making sure we listen, making sure that we do not brush off these people. So those would be things that I think we can do for them. And in the context of really trauma itself, I feel like, as you said earlier, it was a very important point, understanding that the trauma is just one part of what's going on there, and exploring and trying to find what's wrong really.
And I'm curious, do you know, like in the orthopedic realm, let's say, a woman, I can think of a case where a woman came to me and she said she slipped and fell on some stairs. I looked at the X-ray, P1 fracture, which was a car accident. It was my first year in practice, and I thought, man, she must have horrible bone. She didn't have bad bone. She was complaining of neck pain. I happened to get a C-spine film, and it showed she had jumped the steps on a hangman's side fracture. And then I said, you really took a fall off the stairs. And then she told me, she said she was pushed out the window by her partner, right? So, I mean, that illustrates a point of how, she didn't want to tell the truth. It led to this discovery. She was being abused. And then, fortunately, because we got on things in a timely fashion, we were able to treat her spine fracture and treat her tibial P1 fracture. So she wasn't stuck with both emotional scars and crippled physically for the rest of her life. So I think, one thing as a healthcare provider you can do is whatever injuries are sustained that are physical and fixable, I think there's value, obviously, as you would treat anybody else, but at least you can take something off the table that is just constant, a reminder to them. The question I was going to ask you is this, because I saw these cases of these fistulas, and when I talked to Dr. Gloria Kinda, who's also from the Congo, that was one thing she talked about that really seemed to cause a lot of women problems and lead them to being socially stigmatized and wanting to commit suicide, was these fistulas that they develop after being raped. Is there some type of time urgency to, like, rather than hiding in the forest and not coming out, if a woman is sexually assaulted and she can get treated, more urgently, is the outcome of these types of injuries better to where they wouldn't have these fistulas and wouldn't have to carry this around the rest of their life?
Yes and no. Sometimes when the trauma is treated earlier, they're more likely to heal quicker. So you're not going to have a lot of granulation tissue and it's more likely to be okay. But at the same time, if they're very young kids, which in the case of Ethiopia, that's what we have when it comes to fistulas, when they're very young girls, like 12, 13, 14, even if you treat them earlier, the damage is extensive because their anatomy is not ready for what happened to them. So because of that, it's really hard to repair them, and usually takes like 3, 4, 5 procedures to make sure that they heal properly. And sometimes it doesn't succeed because the trauma is quite extensive. And as I said, if they're older, it's better to seek help earlier, and you would have better outcomes with that as well.
And are the resources and skills there to treat these types of injuries, or is this something that needs to be developed?
So here's the thing. With issues like this, they don't only come from sexual trauma, they also come from birth-related issues. There's something called obstructed labor in these parts of the world, where women labor for a really long time and the labor gets, like arrested, and the pressure on the body would create these fistulas themselves. So every surgeon, an OBGYN, is trained with this. So the access is there, but in Ethiopia, for example, I saw a huge stride regarding labor-related fistulas happening nowadays, because access to healthcare is being distributed all over the country, and women are more likely to give birth in hospitals. So arrested labor or obstructed labor is not a thing anymore. I feel like in the next few years, surgeons are going to be, not doing this. So the skills are going to probably, start to fade away with the next generation of surgeons. But as I said, with internally displaced people and trauma, it's still going on. So we really need those skills to kind of stay.
And then acts came back to the district hospital, that which the extent of the problem.
Yep.
And these are coupled from England factors. Alice in creating this huge hospital. And the need was very immense, tremendous. And they not only to surgeons trained for obstetricians, but special.
Yeah. And the hospital is still running. It's a non-profit organization, and it still does the procedures actively. So, but as the training goes, most surgeons are now capable to do this. It's basically like a routine procedure they have to learn how to do, even though it's very complicated. But that's only for Ethiopia. I don't know the rest of Africa, how these things are going.
Right.
Yep. And this is because of also not only sexual violence, but kids were being married off very young. So that was a huge issue in Ethiopia, 10, 15 years ago. Marriage, especially in the highlands of Ethiopia, marriage at the age of 12 was the norm. And that was one of the biggest reasons these fistulas were very common. But nowadays, that's also it's illegal for you to marry off anybody at the age of 12. And the church also had a stance where it said it's unacceptable. Girls need to be 18 to be married. But the culture kind of still goes on in some parts of the country. You cannot change these things quite quickly.
Thank you so much, Dr. Casa. It was a great presentation, and I think everybody can see why, we gave this its own lecture. When we talk about the major causes of trauma,
road traffic accidents, conflict-related violence, self-harm and falls. You can see the self-harm categories are really, really complicated one. And all of them really are. But I think you can also see that, you know, I'm an orthopedic surgeon, but you know, it's focused on trauma, but there's so much more you can do in orthopedic surgery than trauma, right? There's a whole package here. So thank you guys for taking the time to come. Thank you, Dr. Costa. Great.
Thank you so much.